Hello guys, welcome back. So the response to the last video was absolutely insane. I'm still reading through the comments and I feel like we started a support group for Americans having existential crises about their high school history classes. Every single day I stumble upon something that makes me go, wait, why did my AP US history teacher conveniently forget to mention that? We covered the big stuff last time, 1812, the burning of the White House, the whole empire thing. But the rabbit hole, it goes so much deeper, like Mariana Trench deep. I've been digging into the British archives, pestering my British friends, and reading the books they study here, and I have found 10 more times where the American narrative and the British narrative aren't just different, they are living on different planets. We are talking about secret treaties, financial blackmail, kings who weren't actually crazy, and the time the US government basically ghosted Britain during their darkest hour. We are about to shatter some more mythology. This is part 2 of History Books Skipped the British Side. Number 1, the Mad King George III was actually a Renaissance man. Okay, let's start with the big bad villain of the American imagination, King George III. In every movie, every textbook, and yes, even in Hamilton, he is portrayed as this spitting, screaming, tyrannical lunatic. We picture him running around the palace in a bathrobe, shouting at trees, and obsessed with taxing our tea. He is the ultimate caricature of out-of-touch monarchy. But living here, I've learnt that the British view of Farmer George is heartbreakingly different. First off, the madness. Modern medical historians and British schools teach that he wasn't crazy in the way we think. He likely suffered from porphyria, a genetic liver disorder that causes severe physical pain and temporary mental instability. Imagine being in agonizing pain, your skin burning, your mind racing, and your doctors, well, 18th century doctors were basically torturers. They blistered his skin, starved him, and locked him in a straitjacket. The tyrant we learnt about was actually a man suffering a severe medical crisis while trying to run an empire. But here is the part that really shocked me. When he wasn't sick, George III was actually a massive nerd. And I mean that in the best way. He was the first British monarch to study science as part of his education. He built his own observatory. He had a massive collection of scientific instruments. He was obsessed with agriculture, hence the nickname Farmer George, and wrote articles about crop rotation and manure under a fake name. Does that sound like a despot to you? He also amassed one of the greatest libraries in history, which later formed the core of the British Library. And politically, he wasn't trying to be a dictator. He was actually trying to reassert the role of the king within the British Constitution after his predecessors had been a bit lazy. From the British perspective, he wasn't stripping Americans of rights, he was trying to standardize a chaotic empire where the American colonies were behaving like spoiled teenagers who didn't want to follow the house rules. There's this incredible story I learned here about John Adams, our John Adams meeting George III after the war in 1785. Adams is the first US ambassador to London. It's awkward, right? The rebel meeting the king he defeated. But George III wasn't bitter. He said to Adams, "I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, as I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. That is class, that is dignity. But in the US, we just remember the spittle." It makes you realize how much easier it is to fight a war when you dehumanize the guy on the other side. Number 2, World War I. The late arrival versus the lost generation. Let's jump forward to the 20th century. World War I. Now be honest, in your US history class, how much time did you spend on WWI? Maybe a week? We learn about the Lusitania, the Zimmerman telegram, Wilson's 14 points, and then over there, we show up in 1917, shoot some Germans and win the war. It's treated as the prequel to the main event, Twechuy. In Britain, WWI is the event. It is the national trauma that defines modern Britain. And the way they look at our entry into the war, well, it's complicated. For us, 1917 is when the good guys arrived. For the British, 1917 was 3 years too late. By the time American boots hit French soil, Britain had been bleeding out for years. I went to a town in northern England recently, and I saw a war memorial. The list of names for WWI was longer than the list for Echuai. That is normal here. We need to talk about the Battle of the Somme. July 1st, 1916. In American history, this is a vocabulary word. In British history, it is a scar on the soul. On the first day of that battle, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead. In one day, entire towns lost their entire generation of young men because of the PALS battalions, where friends from the same neighborhood signed up together and died together. So when Americans talk about how we won the war, it creates this visceral reaction here. Yes, the American industrial might and fresh troops were crucial to breaking the stalemate in 1918. No sensible historian denies that. But imagine you've been fighting a burglar in your house for 3 hours, you've lost an arm, your house is trashed, and your brother is dead. Then your neighbor walks in with a baseball bat, hits the burglar once, and says, "Man, good thing I'm here to save you, right?" That is the emotional disconnect. To the British, the US spent the first 3 years of the war debating neutrality and selling weapons to both sides, while Europe burned. The war to end all wars shattered the British belief in progress and empire, while for America, it was our coming out party as a superpower. We celebrated the victory, they mourned the cost. Number 3, the proclamation of 1763. We were the land grabbers. Okay, let's go back to the origins of the revolution. We all know the slogan, "No taxation without representation." We know we were fighting for liberty, but liberty to do what, exactly? One of the huge grievances in the Declaration of Independence, though it's wrapped in fancy language, is about land, specifically the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, the British government issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This is a massive deal here, and barely a footnote in the US. This document forbade American colonists from settling west of the Appalachians. Why? Because the British government had signed treaties with the Native American tribes in those regions. They wanted to prevent another expensive war like Pontiac's Rebellion. They saw the Native Americans as subjects of the crown who had rights to their land. To the American colonists, including guys like George Washington, who was a massive land speculator with thousands of acres claimed in that forbidden territory, this was tyranny. We felt we had won that land by fighting the French, and now the king was telling us we couldn't take it. From the British perspective, they were trying to be the adults in the room. They were trying to enforce a border policy to protect indigenous populations and keep the peace. The freedom the colonists were screaming for was, in large part, the freedom to expand into native land against the wishes of the crown. When you look at it this way, the redcoats weren't just oppressors, they were basically border patrol agents trying to stop illegal settlements. It completely flips the moral script. We weren't just fighting for democracy, we were fighting for real estate. And the British government was the only thing standing between the indigenous tribes and the relentless expansion of American settlers. It's a very uncomfortable realization when you look at how the next 100 years of American history played out for Native Americans. The British kind of had a point. Number 4, the special relationship. Took a break in 1956. The Suez crisis. We love to talk about the special relationship. The US and the UK, best friends forever, shoulder to shoulder against the world. But nobody told me about the time the United States effectively destroyed the British Empire in a week. The year was 1956, the Suez crisis. Here is the quick rundown. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which was a vital lifeline for British oil and trade. Britain, France, and Israel hatched a secret plan to invade Egypt and take the canal back. They did it. From a military standpoint, it worked. But politically, it was a disaster. And here is where Uncle Sam comes in. The British assumed the US would support them, or at least look the other way. After all, we were allies against the Soviets, right? Wrong. President Eisenhower was furious. He was in the middle of an election, and he didn't want to be associated with old-school European colonialism. So, did the US send a stern letter? No. We went for the jugular. The US government threatened to sell off its massive holdings of the British pound sterling. We threatened to crash the British economy overnight. We also blocked them from getting emergency loans from the IMF. Britain was humiliated. They had to withdraw their troops in shame. The Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, had to resign. It was the moment the world realized that Great Britain was no longer a superpower. They could only act if the US gave them permission. In British history books, Suez is a watershed moment. It is the end of the empire. It is the moment they realized they were the junior partner. In US history books, it barely exists, maybe a paragraph about Cold War tensions. We completely gloss over the fact that we financially blackmailed our closest ally and forced them into a humiliating retreat. It's a stark reminder that in geopolitics there are no friends, only interests. Number 5, the French connection. It wasn't about liberty. We need to talk about France. In the US, we have this romantic notion of the Marquis de Lafayette. We think France helped us because they loved our ideas about freedom and democracy. They saw the scrappy American fighting for rights and their hearts swelled with Republican pride. The British view? Oh look, the French are weaponizing our colonies again. To the British, the American Revolution wasn't an isolated fight for freedom. It was just another chapter in the Second Hundred Years' War between Britain and France. France didn't give a damn about American liberty. They were an absolute monarchy. They helped us for one reason and one reason only, to stick it to the British. When France entered the war in 1778, the conflict transformed. It went from a local colonial rebellion to a world war. Suddenly, Britain wasn't just worried about Boston and New York. They had to defend Jamaica, Gibraltar, India, and the English Channel. The British Navy, the most powerful force on earth, was stretched thin. There were massive naval battles between the British and French that determined the fate of America, and American soldiers weren't even there. We learn about Yorktown as this American triumph. But let's be real, Yorktown was a French victory. The French Navy blocked the Chesapeake Bay, preventing the British rescue fleet. French troops on the ground made up a huge portion of Washington's army. Without France, the rebellion likely would have been crushed. But in our narrative, we minimize it to foreign aid. We like to think we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. The British know better. They know they weren't beaten by farmers with muskets. They were beaten by the global superpower of France, utilizing a proxy army. It takes the sting out of the loss for them, but it definitely bruises our ego. Number 6, the Trent Affair. We almost started World War Zero, back to the Civil War. Last time we talked about how close Britain came to recognizing the Confederacy because of cotton, but I didn't tell you about the time the United States actually kidnapped people from a British ship and almost started a war. This is the Trent Affair. In 1861, a US Navy ship stopped a British mail steamer, the RMS Trent, in international waters. They boarded it, seized 2 Confederate diplomats who were on their way to London, and took them prisoner. In the North, we celebrated, yeah, we got the traitors. In Britain, absolute fury. You have to understand, the British ruled the waves. The one thing you do not do is mess with a British ship in neutral waters. They viewed it as a violation of international law and a direct insult to the flag. The British government began preparing for war. They sent 11,000 troops to Canada. They put the Royal Navy on high alert. They drafted an ultimatum demanding the release of the prisoners and an apology. If Lincoln had said no, Britain would have entered the Civil War on the side of the South. The Union blockade would have been broken by the Royal Navy, and the Confederacy almost certainly would have won independence. It came down to a razor's edge. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, actually intervened from his deathbed to soften the language of the British ultimatum, so Lincoln had a way to back down without losing face. Lincoln famously said, "One war at a time." He released the prisoners, but we never learn how close we came. We think of the Civil War as this hermetically sealed domestic dispute. In reality, it was a diplomatic tightrope walk, where one wrong move by a hot-headed Navy captain almost changed the map of North America forever. Number 7, the Pacific War, the Forgotten Army. When we think of World War II in the Pacific, what do we see? Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Midway, the US Marines island hopping toward Japan. It's an American show, but while we were doing that, the British were fighting a massive, brutal land war against the Japanese in Burma, modern-day Myanmar, and India. This is known here as the Forgotten Army. For years, the British 14th Army fought in some of the worst conditions imaginable: jungles, malaria, monsoon rains. And this wasn't just white guys from London. This was the British Empire. We are talking about millions of Indian soldiers, African troops from Nigeria and Kenya, Gurkhas from Nepal. It was one of the most diverse fighting forces in history. They stopped the Japanese invasion of India. They inflicted the largest land defeat on the Japanese army in its history up to that point. But in American culture, it doesn't exist. We have The Pacific on HBO. We have Letters from Iwo Jima. Where is the movie about the Battle of Kohima? Where is the recognition that while we were owning the ocean, the British and Commonwealth forces were grinding it out on the continent? A British veteran once told me, "You Americans think you defeated Japan. You defeated the Japanese Navy. We defeated the Japanese army in the field." It's a generalization, sure, but the erasure of the Commonwealth's contribution in our textbooks is staggering. We treat the British like they were only fighting in Europe. Number 8. The Stamp Act riots. We were the terrorists. Let's go back to the very beginning. The Stamp Act 1765. We learn that we protested, we marched, we boycotted. It sounds very noble, very Martin Luther King Jr., but if you read the accounts from the British officials living in America at the time, it looked a lot less like protest and a lot more like terrorism. The Sons of Liberty? To the British, they were a mob, a violent gang. They didn't just hold signs. They tore down the houses of stamp collectors. They attacked government officials in the street. I mentioned tarring and feathering in the last video, but the psychological terror went further. There is a famous story about Thomas Hutchinson, the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. A mob attacked his house. They didn't just break windows, they smashed down the doors with axes, drank his wine, stole his money, destroyed his furniture, and actually tore the roof off the building. Hutchinson and his family barely escaped with their lives. Why? Because he enforced the law. From London's perspective, this wasn't a political debate. This was a breakdown of law and order. Imagine if a group of people today didn't like a tax policy, so they burned down the IRS commissioner's house and chased his family into the night. We wouldn't call them patriots, we would call them criminals. This context explains why the British government cracked down so hard later. They weren't just being mean, they were reacting to what they saw as violent anarchy. They thought they were dealing with the 18th century version of a cartel, not a burgeoning democracy. Number 9. Bletchley Park versus the Manhattan Project. If you ask an American what the biggest scientific achievement of World War I was, we say the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. Robert Oppenheimer, the ultimate weapon that ended the war. If you ask a Brit, they will say Bletchley Park. While we were building a bomb to blow things up, the British were building the world's first computers to hack into the German mind, the Enigma code. We've all seen The Imitation Game, but the scale of this is often lost in US schools. The intelligence gathered at Bletchley Park, codenamed Ultra, is estimated to have shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. Without it, the Battle of the Atlantic might have been lost, and D-Day might never have happened. But here is the kicker. The British kept this a secret for decades. The US shouted about the atom bomb from day one, but the British destroyed their computers and swore everyone to silence. It wasn't until the 1970s that the public even knew what Alan Turing and his team had done. Because of this secrecy, the American narrative of technological superiority took over. We got the credit for winning the war with science. But the British argue that while we provided the brawn and the uranium, they provided the brain. They outsmarted the Nazis. And honestly, breaking an unbreakable code is just as cool as a big explosion, if not cooler. Number 10, the Fenian Raids. That time Irish Americans invaded Canada. Okay, this last one is my absolute favourite because it is so bizarre and I had never heard of it until I moved here. After the Civil War, thousands of Irish immigrants who had fought for the Union Army were sitting around with military training, rifles, and a deep hatred of Britain. They formed a group called the Fenian Brotherhood. Their plan? Invade Canada. Yes, you heard me. They wanted to invade Canada, hold it hostage, and trade it back to Britain in exchange for Ireland's independence. It sounds like the plot of a bad comedy movie, but it actually happened. Between 1866 and 1871, these guys launched multiple raids across the border. They fought battles against Canadian militias and British troops. People died. Now here is the skipped history part. The US government kind of let it happen. Why? Because we were still mad at Britain for the whole building Confederate ships thing. See point 6 and the last video. President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State Seward dragged their feet on stopping the Fenians because they enjoyed seeing Britain sweat. They used these raids as diplomatic leverage. To the Canadians and the British, this was outrageous. The US was allowing a private army to launch invasions from its soil into a peaceful neighbour. It actually helped unify Canada. The threat of American invasion was a huge motivator for the Canadian Confederation in 1867. So in a way, the US accidentally helped create modern Canada by being a terrible neighbor. But in our history books, total silence. It doesn't fit the narrative of the US as the responsible peacekeeper, so there you have it, 10 more examples of how the view from London changes everything. When you look at the Mad King as a suffering human, or the tyranny as an attempt to protect native land, or the victory in 1918 as a late arrival to a funeral, the simple black and white story of American greatness gets a lot more grey. And that's okay. In fact, it's better. History isn't a superhero movie. It's a messy, complex web of conflicting interests, misunderstandings, and varying perspectives. The British aren't the villains of our story, and we aren't always the heroes of theirs. We are just two nations, tangled up in a centuries-long argument, occasionally trying to kill each other, occasionally saving each other, and mostly just trying to figure out who has to pay the bill. I'm sure I'll find 10 more of these next week, but for now, I'm going to go apologize to a portrait of George III. Thanks for watching, guys. If you learned something new, or if you're a Brit who wants to correct my pronunciation of lieutenant, drop a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more identity crises from across the pond. See ya!